Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod, where we amplify voices from across the agricultural industry. We aggregate those perspectives and work to elevate our collective thinking around strategy execution. I'm your host, Joe Mosier. On this show, we regularly highlight some of the differentiating challenges and advantages to the cooperative model. We do this both through, my personal observations and the work that we do with clients, but we also do it through the lenses of, the cooperative leaders and the veterans that we routinely have on this program, talking about their experiences and their winning strategies to their careers. But when it comes to governance specifically, I think that we probably are overweight talking about the challenge side of the ledger. The headline messages are usually around the challenges, where things are perhaps causing drag to the company, where they're resulting in suboptimal decisions. And again, I think this understates the strengths and benefits of the model. And that's something I'd like to talk more about in this program. Here's a question just to illustrate the point. When was the last time that you're aware of that a publicly traded company provided its customers the chance to vote out the CEO? Not some activist investor accumulated, X% of openly traded shares and then influenced institutional capital that also had equity positions in that company to eventually force a vote and mobilize through proxy a significant portion of shareholders to change board composition and then ultimately change leadership. That's a bit different. We're talking about specifically the owner or the customer base gets to vote, albeit indirectly, on the future CEO of that company. That, as an example, is simply the cooperative model at work, right? Farmer boards are comprised of the democratically elected representatives of the ownership base of the institution. And that's a structural advantage that I think we ought to talk about. Not so much talk about it because of the ability to vote on senior management and fire the boss. That's more of an illustration of the structural advantage. And it's really just a teaser to get us started. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, a quick reminder to like and subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. You can do it right now. It doesn't cost you a thing. It's the best way to ensure that you never miss any new episodes as they come out every Wednesday. And it's the best way to support the program. And if you're so kind, we'd also love it if you consider leaving us a review. Thank you, as always, for your support. So let's start here today, first by level setting on what, or rather why, the cooperative governance model exists. Not a history lesson, just more context. Farmers, as we know, are price takers on both their inputs to production and the goods that they eventually bring to market via the harvest. Price taking in both directions in a business that's already burdened with a myriad of external exogenous risks that you can't control, weather, supply and demand markets, population growth, trade disruptions, infrastructure, whatever it is, that kind of burden always puts pressure on maintaining profitability and sometimes even viability at the farm gate. Now, if you're interested in the history of co-ops, back in April of this year, in an episode of the AgTech So What podcast, Sarah Nolette was joined by Matthew Pryor and friend of the show here, Shane Thomas, and they actually followed the breadcrumbs back to the inception of the cooperative model. It was a super interesting discussion. I'll link to it in the show notes, and that'll be a great history lesson. But for our purposes today, what I really want to highlight is the core logic, and this is refresher for most, if not all of you, but I think it's worth stating again. The core logic was that farmers, as individuals, face this seemingly insurmountable market concentration of power, both from input suppliers and from their output buyers. And the cooperative model, as a counterbalance to that, puts the economic interests of the producers structurally first, right? The co-op helps aggregate their demand for input products and services. It also aggregates their supply to bring it to market in a meaningful way. It provides collective ownership of a leg or legs in the supply chain. And it's also, frankly, a de-risking exercise that is accomplished through shared prosperity, right? It's not solely based on individual performance of your crop, but actually how a collection a regional concentration of growers working together can create value and access the market with their production. Now, we should also highlight, I think this is important. We won't talk about it a lot today, but it's really important to highlight it here that owners of co-ops have both economic and voting rights. And of course, the economic rights are commonly, not exclusively, but commonly in the form of patronage that reflects a reward mechanism based on the business transacted with the co-op over a period of time, usually a fiscal year, right? How many of your inputs did you buy? How many additional services were procured? How much of your grain was delivered or marketed through the co-op? Things like that result in a patronage, which is sort of a dividend based on the profitability of the organization in that year. But then you also have the voting rights. And those are really interesting because they're codified as one owner, one vote, meaning it's normalized. Larger farmers don't necessarily have larger voting rights and representation. Each owner of that co-op votes equally. That one member, one vote is really key. And frankly, it's the sole mechanism for electing the board representatives for a district. And kind of back to that having the ability to put your fingerprints on the future and the trajectory and the direction of the cooperative. And so with that in place, that's why the model exists. When we now kind of think about governance, I think there's some underappreciated benefits of what farmer boards do well. And again, we might be tempted, when you hear these, you might be tempted to discount them in the face of all the abundant anecdotal evidence that you have to the contrary. I have the same, right? For every one of these things I'm going to tell you is an advantage, I've seen it go the other direction. But just because the lived experience is a bit different than what I'm going to say doesn't mean that what I'm going to say is untrue. And so we need to look at the structural set of objectives and incentives and recognize that the market is a much more dynamic place than an alternate reality where we only have investor or privately owned firms in the marketplace. Co-ops create a more dynamic marketplace. So for each of these, again, you're going to be tempted to provide a counterpoint, and that's fine. We can do that. But let's also just sit with each of these for the moment. So I want to highlight 3 underappreciated benefits of what farmer boards do well. The first is just ground level market intelligence in the boardroom, right? A farmer director knows what basis is doing in his or her trade area. They know what the agronomist is saying. They know what kind of services are being offered to them as a customer. They know how responsive and of what quality those services provided are. They know what the competitors are doing down the road, both where they're struggling as well as they're doing better. And frankly, there's no hired independent director that's going to be able to replicate that. It just doesn't exist. And so I think this ground level market intelligence in the boardroom is a really, really important factor. Now, there's a flip side to it, and we will get to that. But let's just recognize that that's a unique benefit of the cooperative model. The second is, frankly, mission alignment and constant recalibration. So in an investor-owned firm or a privately owned firm, you might need governance structures or even periodic sort of corporate resets to keep management from drifting so far towards shareholder returns that it's coming profoundly at the expense of farmer prosperity and farmer benefits. And this kind of divergence between shareholder returns and customer success can really grow as the organization grows. It really creates more separation between the boardroom and the marketplace as a result of the organization's success in scaling their operation. In a co-op, conversely, the board is the patron. So objectively, the incentive alignment is both structural and it's durable, right? If the co-op exists to, again, aggregate supply and demand, own a leg of the supply chain, de-risk farming and agricultural production through shared prosperity, that mission alignment and calibration should constantly be in place because of the fact that the board is, in fact, a patron as well. And the third one is kind of building on both of these, though, but it's accountability with some actual skin in the game. And now my intention here is not to disparage independent directors in any way. They provide profound value. And the privately owned firms that we work with that have independent directors, professional independent directors have joined them, it has created a hell of a lot of discomfort and heartburn and sometimes friction among that governance body. but almost unanimously to the upside over a period of time through a better rigor, better questioning, better execution, just better thinking, a more complete thinking, maybe is a better way of putting it in the boardroom. So, with all that said, I'm not disparaging independent directors, but farmer directors aren't there just to collect director fees, right? One, those gigs don't pay enough for that to be an economic benefit worth trading your time for. But you think about it, their equity, their patronage, their neighbors' livelihoods, all of that is in the mix. They own the business. They transact with the business, hopefully. And most aspects of their personal and their professional lives are conducted in the shadow of that business. And so again, if you sit here and think about this, if you don't believe that market intelligence in the boardroom, that mission alignment and calibration across ownership, board directors, and management, and that having a governance body with the long-term stakes and organizational outcomes are meaningful advantages, if you don't think that actually is a benefit, then I think we're just going to have to politely agree to disagree. Because taken at face value, those are very unique differentiating upsides, unique to the cooperative governance model. So let's be fair, though, and let's stay rooted in the real world. If there are so many structural benefits to the cooperative governance model, Joe, where are the farmer boards breaking down? We have so many issues. So how does this happen? And I'm not dismissing or sort of trying to argue that there are not challenges. This is a recognized, a researched, a documented problem with plenty of faces, something we encounter all the time. And what I'm trying to do here is not discount the upside simply because the story's most worth retelling for their entertainment value, for their head scratching value, for their, WTF just happened value. I don't want to discount the upsides just because of some of these stories that we hear. I recently, as I was thinking about this year and this year and some of the conversations I've had both in front of a mic as well as not with co-op leaders and other folks that advise and work with co-ops, I was trying to figure, okay, what does the actual research say? What has been objectively studied out here beyond all of us regurgitating our felt experience? And I read some interesting research that was published in 2023, so relatively recent, and we will link to it in the show notes. But it was a qualitative assessment of farmer director skills in ag co-ops specifically. And there's a few themes that they highlighted that show, where the drift from that structural advantage that I just highlighted to the persistent challenges that we're all thinking about right now, where those might originate from. And there's three here that I just want to highlight for you. The first is probably the default one that we hear the most, and that's the personal agenda problem. Sometimes this is referred to as someone not taking off their farmer hat to put on their board hat. But, in my experience, no one will personally admit to this applying to them, at least not in open, not in front of their peers. But it's rampant. Directors either explicitly or subconsciously, they run for the board ultimately to protect their district, which is fine. But then it goes beyond protecting their district. It goes to protecting their commodity, protecting their operation, or really focusing on their axe to grind. And not necessarily stepping back and say, I represent a district that is part of an overall cooperative. And so what is the relationship between cooperative success and my district's success? And I can't vote solely in my district's interests without at least considering what is the implication for cooperative success. This is the myopia challenge, right? And it's probably very akin to what our esteemed leaders in the high-functioning congressional bodies of the Senate and the House deal with every day, right? You've got the things that you're trying to do for your district and your representatives and the people that you represent. And sometimes the near-term thing that might be best for them might be at odds with the long-term benefits to the country. And that's a constant trade-off. But this is, the challenge here in the personal agenda problem is that trying to help board members transition from the what's good for me to what's good for the membership. It's an incredibly hard thing for new members to do. It's a very hard thing for new members to face. And frankly, as we all know, some of them never fully make it. So when we think about where does this break down from the benefits I just shared to the felt challenges, the personal agenda problem is, in my mind, front and center, one of the biggest ones. The next one that's actually, arguably over time catching up, and we've had some folks in the show talk about this here over the past several months or even the last year, but it's the complexity gap. I mean, co-ops today, there are some single location co-ops or single digit location co-ops that are hyper localized and relatively straightforward businesses. But a lot of co-ops today are running 500 million plus dollar businesses, billion, multi-billion dollars in terms of turnover and revenue. And so if you think about the complexity of that organization, and then you think about the governance skills required to do a good job, I mean, the ability to read financial statements, to rigorously evaluate a diversified corporate strategy, to be able to manage the performance of a CEO who's trying to steer that ship. These aren't automatically present just because someone runs a successful farming operation and they earn the trust and respect and votes of their neighbors, right? Being a successful farmer indicates that you know a lot about farming and you know quite a bit about the agricultural and ag supply chain business space. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be operating at a level and have all the professional experiences and skills required to provide governance, effective governance for these organizations that are increasingly getting larger and larger and larger. It's not a shot at board members at all. It's simply stating a set of facts. The co-ops that we're governing today look nothing like the co-ops of 20, 30, 50 years ago.
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
And then the third one that they highlighted in this study was just the recruiting crisis. And we're not going to go into detail on this. We've talked about it a little bit in the show. But, sometimes the people that are most qualified to serve, particularly from that complexity gap problem, maybe they're experienced folks, they're mid-career farmers. They're both living in the world of how business has been done with also an eye towards how business is going to be conducted in the future. Perhaps they've had some successful private or corporate careers concurrent with their farming career because it's increasingly difficult to just farm for a living. They bring some of those different experiences, some of those different professional capabilities that maybe others don't. But they're also the busiest, right? They probably are highly involved in their community, often have young families, have a variety of obligations that make serving as a board director incredibly challenging. And so it makes it tough because from a recruiting standpoint, the pipeline's pretty thin for some of those candidates. And so boards tend to skew a bit older. Now, age is not a proxy for dysfunction by any sort of means, but we know that next-gen engagement, folks that are thinking about where the co-op needs to go to meet the emerging needs of the farmers in the future is a real structural problem, not just optics. Right? This isn't about having younger faces on the website or younger faces on the stage during the annual meeting. This is actually about how are we going to find the people that are going to be the best stewards of the co-op into the future. And frankly, are they willing and able to step up and do the work? And increasingly, we're seeing that that's a gap. So I'd like to kind of bring this together and we've talked about what the structural advantages are from my standpoint. We talked a little bit about where the research says that some of these things might diverge. Again, I'll link to that study in the show notes if you're interested in some further reading. But I want to bring this back together to talk about what good governance looks like from a practical standpoint. And this is kind of talking about some matters of maybe policy or process that hopefully you can take with you and reflect on how well you might or maybe are or are not creating the conditions for governance success within your cooperative organization. This may apply outside of co-ops too, but we're talking specifically to co-ops today. Now, I've developed my own short list of what I call, key markers of effective boards, something that I share in all of our engagements at the upfront to sort of provide a point of view to challenge membership to think about their own performance, their own mindsets, how they're doing their work. And I'd love to share that with you, but to keep things simple today, we're probably going to kick that to a future episode. So with that said, what procedurally separates co-ops with high functioning boards from ones that struggle? There's a handful here, but if we solve these, or if you've solved these within your organization, you're probably leaps and bounds ahead of your competition. The first one is really important, and that's that director education is ongoing. It's not just onboarding. So many co-ops have very robust and rigorous new director training and onboarding, right? From sending you off to state or federal level training, board director certification programs, making sure that you're steeped in the knowledge about the state in which you operate, reading bylaws, having access to a lot of training. And that's really great because it level sets and establishes a baseline level of knowledge and ultimately competence that everyone needs to have. But it needs to be ongoing. Continuous education, continuous development is what helps keep people growing in those roles. You're not going to learn everything you need to learn in the first 6 months of your board director career. Why would we stop teaching you at 6 months? So that's a big one. Another one is, I think there's a real opportunity for cooperatives to have some explicit norms around the board and CEO boundary. Right? We all kind of intuitively have a sense of how do you distinguish governance from management. But how we distinguish it individually might not be effective collectively. Right? We might not be using the same language. And when we don't use the same language, we might have some different conclusions. And we have different conclusions, and we look at a live or a hypothetical case study, we might arrive at some very different decisions in how we choose to behave and at what level we choose to engage. And so I think having some explicit norms that are introduced during onboarding, but then consistently reset and put in front of people is a huge step forward. There's some opportunity to just think about both term limits for board directors and then also succession planning for the board itself. So we often think about succession planning for the C-suite of the cooperative. At least I hope that you are. If you're not, separate conversation. So succession planning for the board is really important, but also term limits. And what's interesting is sometimes term limits actually is a forcing mechanism to get better at succession planning, because you know that there's a certain strength of an intact governance group that functions really well, is doing really good things, and has that mojo, that has the co-op growing and firing on all cylinders. It has a shelf life, because in a period of time, certain number of membership are going to basically term out. And so you need to be proactive in thinking about that. So that's an area you could be looking at. Akin to that is the fourth one, is recruiting for the next generation before the seat is empty. Really, really important. And people do lots of different types of approaches. I've seen associate director positions, sort of non-voting positions, other types of ways that a membership get involved periodically on committees in doing certain types of preparatory sort of work ahead of board meetings or annual meetings. There's different ways to engage people, but getting the word out, and when you talk about how you're going to develop people, when you talk about here's the difference between governance and management, you talk about term limits and succession planning, you kind of create the conditions where you actually might be more effective in recruiting people in. And then the last one, and this one's contentious, something we've talked about in the show plenty, and we're going to talk about a lot more in the months ahead, but getting some clarity around the board's role in approving and owning strategy. The idea that you're not just ratifying what management brings in is a really important thing to be discussing. But saying you don't just ratify it also doesn't necessarily mean that you develop it. And there's a wide spectrum of perspectives on this issue. Again, we will discuss this. We'll continue to discuss in the program. But I think for you all in your co-op, you need to think about it collectively. CEO, board chair, vice chair, membership, directors at large. How do we look at the development, the approval, and the ownership of strategy? How do we think about that in terms of governance versus management and getting a line there? When you do those things, director education, governance versus management, term limits and succession planning, recruiting the next generation, and this strategy question, you really have kind of moved the needle on effective governance, leveraging those structural strengths we started with at the top of the show. Now, this show is for operators and practitioners, not academics. So here's a little call to action, right? Something I want you to leave with today that hopefully helps you synthesize a lot of this as you reflect on the work that you're doing. If you're a co-op leader or a general manager, ask yourself this question: when is the last time that you genuinely spent significant, open, unstructured time? And that's important. Significant, open, unstructured time with your board to hear how they view their role, both from the founding objectives, what's their role in terms of the co-op's reason for existing, but also what's their role and how they believe they should be engaging with you, how they should be engaging with membership, right? What their role is on the board while they're serving as a director. This is not about putting it on the agenda for a half hour or an hour and we talk about it and we jot down some notes and we're done. No, this is actually something in terms of annual retreats or biannual retreats. Perhaps you do something uncomfortable and you have a big chunk of time dedicated to a discussion topic where you're not going to make a decision, but you're going to plant the seeds to raise awareness, create shared language, and perhaps be able to come back for a more productive conversation in the future. Time's at a premium, I know, but if you can do this, it's really going to sort of start to create those conditions for alignment and success. In addition to that, when's the last time that you asked them what they needed from you, from your team, from the state cooperative association, what they felt like they needed to be successful? And then again, how are you helping create those conditions for them to develop and become stronger and more effective over time? Conversely, if you're a board member, have you defined your role for yourself? Have you, journaled or jotted down your thoughts around that? How you see your role, why you're in that chair, both what's the purpose of the role objectively and independent of you, and then also why you felt like you had to be there, right? And have you explicitly shared that with others? Been very honest and upfront, to a degree being quite vulnerable. This is why I think this role exists, and this is why I think I need to be in that role. Here's where my self-interest aligns. Here's what I'm advocating for. Here's what's kind of got me a little bit ticked off. And then, as you do that, and you do it with your neighbor, your neighboring director, of course, are you and they aligned? Are you and the board at large aligned? And then think about this, kind of going back to the original reason for the co-op existing. How do you rate your performance when you take moments to reflect? Are you being that sort of market intelligence voice from the marketplace into the boardroom that we talked about as a structural advantage? Do you feel like you have mission alignment where you are ensuring that there's a focus on creating member value in the board and management level decisions, not just value today, but value tomorrow? And the long-term accountability, do you feel like you're living that out? Are you transacting with the co-op? Are you productively doing business with the co-op? Are you providing those feedback loops, and can they count on you? And how are you performing at your level? Are you performing at a level the membership deserves? Especially when you think about things like the personal agenda problem that we talked about earlier, right? Separating your personal interests from the interests of the membership at large. How do you think you're doing at managing complexity? It's okay to say that I don't understand the difference between a cash flow statement and the balance sheet and the P&L. What am I looking at across these three financial statements? It's a hell of a lot better for you to say it, be vulnerable, and get the resources and support you need to understand why those three are important, than to sit there and act like you'll figure it out or it's not that big of a deal, right? How comfortable are you with the complexity of the organization? Do you feel equipped to be additive in the discussions? Saying, I don't feel ready, doesn't mean you're not fit for the job. It means we need to do things to make sure that you are as effective as possible, and you need some help. And that's then responsibility of the board at large and management to get you that help. And also, what are you doing to help recruit the next generation, right? Are you being that recruitment funnel? Are you out there talking about what's required? Are you talking about the impact that you can have? Are you talking about why the co-op is important and here's what we need? Are you also hearing, here's what the barriers are to next generation growers getting involved? And being that feedback loop, that market intelligence in a dramatic new way, back into the room to say, guys, we've got a couple of crackerjack candidates. We'd love to get them in here. Here's some of their concerns. Here's the themes. what can we do to help support folks with younger families or folks that are, farming and have professional careers or whatever the barrier is? What can we do to help that? And then taken together, guys, how are you as the GM and you as the board chair primarily going to ensure that this important these reflections are taking place? Those themes are identified and an action plan is being created. You're the connective tissue that can make that happen. And you need to hold yourselves accountable for doing that. And that's what will create those conditions for success. We'll close with this. I think the cooperative governance model is one of the most durable, competitive structures in American agriculture. It's really, really quite profound. None of us can remember a marketplace where we didn't have it. So as much as we might bemoan the way things have gone in certain periods of time or certain management teams or certain co-ops or wherever the trend around consolidation has been, try imagining an agricultural marketplace that doesn't have cooperatives in it. If you're comfortable with what that looks like, that's fine. I don't necessarily know that I would be. And so we need to know that the structural advantages we highlighted today, they don't predetermine success. There is significant drift. And over time, that drift does come at the expense of co-op effectiveness. And when co-ops suffer, the opportunity for farmers to grow through what the co-ops have to offer also suffers. Whether the co-ops remain relevant, durable, and additive is going to depend on how you and yours and the folks around you tackle these challenges. And so I encourage you to take it seriously. I'd love to hear from you what's working, what's not working. This is a really important discussion, something we're going to keep hammering here on the show. So thank you as always for tuning in today. I really appreciate you being part of the Pacesetter Pod, being a part of this community, taking the time to tune in, to listen to what myself and others have to say around some issues that we believe are very relevant and impactful to the work that you're doing. This is all about turning strategy into outcomes. And we certainly hope that it's helping you think differently and more rigorously around how you can do that. So thanks again for joining today. I look forward to having you next time right here on the Pacesetter Pod.
This is the podcastfactory.com.